Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. For everyone who's received an email from me, my name is Prashasti, and we're really excited to welcome all of our panelists today for a discussion on immigration and settler colonialism as part of our Scholar series on immigration. And Immigration And is a new justice-oriented program that I created to explore these interdisciplinary topics within immigration with a particular focus on collective liberation. And it's open and accessible to everyone, so I'll drop a link in the chat for you to explore. But today's space is a space of reflection and some imagination. So we will start today with welcoming our fabulous panelists and then be in conversation with them for about 45 to 50 minutes. And then we'll end with some resources that I will follow up in a email as well. So don't worry if you miss them. And with that, I will hand it over to our incredible staff editor, Hamsa, who is a staff editor on the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal and will be moderating our conversation today.
Hello all, my name is Hamsa Fayed. I'm a 2L here at Georgetown, and I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. I wanted to invite all of the panelists to introduce themselves very briefly, keeping it under a minute. Prashasti will drop links with the panelists' bios as well, so you can feel free to make it as brief as possible because your full bios will be in the chat. So can we please start with Professor Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz?
Thanks. Well, I'm a professor emeritus at California State University. I'm a historian and author of 12 books, including Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, and An Indigenous People's History of the United States, and most recently, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. I do studies of both European and US settler colonialism, as well as administrative colonialism.
Thank you, Dr. Ortiz, Dunbar-Ortiz. Can we, I invite Professor Rebecca Tsosie to also introduce herself.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for organizing this amazing panel. My name is Rebecca Tsosie. I am Yaqui Yoeme from Arizona. I'm a Regents Professor of Law at the University of Arizona, and I serve as the faculty co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. And I teach and write in the areas of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and cultural resources and environment. So land rights, water rights, and my newest work is really on reparations and reconciliation. What does it mean to be a citizen within that land-based notion? So I look forward to our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your introduction. If we could please move on to Professor Monika Batra Kashyap.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal for having me. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today and to which we call home. I currently teach at Seattle University School of Law and reside on the unceded, occupied, and seized Coast Salish territories of the Duwamish peoples. As a non-Indigenous daughter of immigrants from India, whose history of colonization is linked to the colonization of the United States, from India, which was colonized by the same kinds of white folks and colonial structures that colonized and are colonizing the United States, I understand my complicity in and responsibility to challenge settler colonialism, and I strive to support the struggles for Indigenous self-determination. I'm honored to be here with you all today on this wonderful panel with this wonderful series. Most of all, I'm honored to be with Roxanne, Desiree, Rebecca, whose work is profoundly inspiring, and I look forward to our time together today. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Moving on to our last but not least, PhD candidate Desiree Valadares.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thanks for Prashasti and Hamsa, and I'm sure many other folks whose labor and time makes this series possible. So as a student, just want to acknowledge that and thank you for bringing us all together. So my name is Desiree. I'm a South Asian settler, immigrant, Canadian citizen, and international student currently in the US. I'm completing my PhD in architectural history at UC Berkeley. It's a fairly interdisciplinary program with dipping my toes into the law school. I mainly work on Asian North American, and Indigenous relations, and I study the preservation of World War II internment or confinement landscapes that have unresolved land claims in Alaska, Hawaii, and British Columbia. And today I'm speaking to you from Washoe lands in the Sierras, lands and waters, I should say. I'm currently in South Lake Tahoe, and I just look forward to our conversation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for complying with the very short introductions. I know it's painful because I think the audience can probably see that you have all done a lot of work, but we wanted to kind of give time for our discussion. And with that, my first question is sort of trying to build the conversation for the topic of settler colonialism, and specifically the foundation of our discussion. So the first question is, we wanted to begin by exposing how immigrant laws perpetuate or sustain settler colonialism. And perhaps you can speak about what histories or mechanisms come to your mind that are actively silenced, and how is settler colonialism manifested in and perpetuated through our current immigration policies? Why is the narrative nation of immigrants harmful, and what purpose does it serve? I know that's a lot of questions, or maybe a lot of questions thrown at you. So not sure if maybe we could, I think you guys have been given these questions in advance, but perhaps we'll throw it down in the chat. But yeah, so I don't know if anyone would like to jump in on it to start the conversation, but I know that each of our panelists have definitely exposed or talked about a number of histories or mechanisms that aren't necessarily in the mainstream or mainstream sort of academia or the history of immigration.
I'm happy to start. What I didn't mention in my intro, but maybe you read, is that I've been teaching an immigration clinic at Seattle University School of Law. So perhaps as a immigration lawyer, someone who's practiced immigration law for 20 years and taught it in a clinical law context, which I imagine a lot of the students here have participated in, it might make sense for me to speak to this question of how immigration laws perpetuate or sustain settler colonialism. So 3 ways in my mind. Number 1 is just giving borders legitimacy. Number 1, giving them wholesale legitimacy, denying that their very existence is a form of geographical, what Edward Said calls geographical violence of imperialism. I think those at Georgetown, there's a recent article written by one of your own, Professor Munshi, called Unsettling Borders that just came out. I highly recommend it, which speaks exactly to this very fact that, giving legitimacy to borders is failing to examine the historical processes of conquest and expansion and all the formations that naturalize and legitimate them. So that's number 1, that there's even borders that we are navigating and controlling through our immigration laws. Number 2 is the erasure of Indigenous peoples and the erasure of their pre-existence. And number 3 is really that that immigration laws, all laws, are really one of the engines of settler colonialism, one of the three foundational mechanisms by which settler colonialism operates. If the number one is the ongoing process of Indigenous elimination, if number two is the ongoing process of subordinating racialized outsiders, there needs to be a system of laws that supports both of those in an ongoing way. And that's where our legal system comes in, and that's where our immigration laws come in. So in a short sentence, immigration laws are the engine of settler colonialism. That's my part.
I can go next if you want. Well, I'm a historian. I'm very interested in what legal experts' perspectives. It's a little bit different, but I think we have to really delineate what is an immigrant and what is a settler. So immigrants join existing polities, whereas settlers create new ones. And if the Europeans that created the North American colonies and subsequent United States had been immigrants, they would have joined the existing polities. Instead, they destroyed those polities and built a new one that was reinforced by later waves of settlement. So the nation of immigrants rhetoric that avoids the dynamics of settler colonialism plays a role that is essential to settler colonial nation states projects such as the United States and Israel. The political project of the settler to create and fortify the colonial nation state becomes obscured by the non-political project of the immigrant who merely seeks to take advantage of what the state allows every citizen. And I think it's important to understand that settlers are unique migrants made by conquest, not by immigration. Settlers are founders of political orders and carry their sovereignty with them, whereas immigrants face a political order that is already constituted. And certainly immigrants can be individually co-opted within the settler colonial societies, and most often are, but they do not really ever enjoy the inherent rights in the United States and are characterized by a defining lack of sovereign entitlement. Immigrants and refugees to the United States do have the option to resist becoming settlers, although in most cases they don't even know the history of the United States or the political reality. And the US Immigration and Naturalization Service policies based on exclusion make the new immigrants' life precarious, particularly for immigrants of color entering a racial order that renders them suspect already. So they may not want to know the reality or that they have a choice and that by default they become settlers. So it's really our task to help them on their way to resisting becoming settlers.
I can go next, and I want to thank Monika and Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz for setting that up so nicely, and respond to both of you as a legal scholar who primarily works on Indigenous rights. But I also teach constitutional law, and what Professor Dunbar-Ortiz said is actually very true. So the United States Constitution envisions this new nation founded on equality and liberty and all of these lofty ideals, but it really set a very stringent standard for who could be a citizen, right? For 100 years, it was free white people. That's the only people that could be citizens. So Indigenous people could never be citizens until Congress actually enacted the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. So Indigenous peoples in the United States are citizens, quote unquote, of this constitutional democracy because of a federal statute that was enacted under Congress's plenary power over Indigenous peoples. And though there are only two places in the Constitution where Congress has plenary power. One is over immigration and one is over Indigenous peoples. You know, so it doesn't, you don't have to look too far to see the synergy between those concepts. So what are we actually saying today? And I think today, in terms of the immigration policy, and you know, Monica, you teach this stuff, so I don't teach immigration law, but what I see on the southern border is that race identity of Native people. My tribe is split by the border. If you're born in Mexico, you're not eligible for enrollment in a federally recognized tribe. You know, so those people are categorized as Mexican immigrants into the United States, and maybe one day they could become citizens of the United States. Well, what does it mean to be a citizen of the land is what I'm interested in. And that is the world without those artificial borders of US settler sovereignty that negates Indigenous identity, as my colleagues have beautifully explained. And then the last thing I want to say is self-determination, which we'll talk about later. I think one of the questions actually directly gets to that. But self-determination is the inherent human right of a people. Trans-border people are split by this artificial construct of a citizen within the settler nation state. And that is something that has to be cured. And together, I think international law and Indigenous rights scholars can think about these legal constructs in a way that is more meaningful for our future. So thank you.
I'll pick up from there because I think this question made me think about a mentor at Berkeley who had published an article when I first arrived. Her name is Letty Volpe, and she's a legal scholar. Her 2015 piece is The Indigenous as Alien. And she's actually looking at how the term alien can be used not only to describe a migrant, and she begins with kind of a trilogy of cases that respond to the exclusion and deportation of mainly Asian migrants, Chinese and Japanese non-citizens, who couldn't actually find white witnesses to testify these laborers' residence in the US as of a particular date, but how that term alien is also applied to an Indigenous person who can be governed under the same laws. But as an architectural historian, what really intrigued me about that piece was the way she conceptualizes and studies and teases out space and time in immigration law and its relationship to indigeneity, but also settler colonialism. So she talks very specifically, and this could go back to Monica's point, of the spatial model of territorial sovereignty that doesn't really capture layer sovereignty. And it doesn't capture, just to put it in very simple terms, it doesn't envision what she calls fuzzy spaces or transitional zones or bleeding boundaries, but instead it suggests this world of nations that is territorialized and colored like a school atlas. That was a very evocative picture for me. And as someone who bears the title as non-resident alien, as I'm an international student in the US, I was very interested in how this term alien has been used in legal kind of legislation. And this is for my own interest in situating myself to my research, but also understanding my position in academia in the US, where this semester I'm technically in absentia, which means I am absent, and that's my enrollment status with the school. And I'm kind of afraid to travel through borders because of these multiple kind of statuses I have even today, where I'm officially disappeared from the record, even though I very much exist. I'm sitting in my home, I'm paying my taxes and paying my bills, but I carry these sort of labels that have a much longer and heavy history. So I'll end there, but looking forward to continuing this.
Thank you for that. And thank you for all sharing your responses to the first question. I think that this is a good transition also to our next question, where we're trying to talk a little bit more about settler decolonization and legal advocacy and activism. We'll also drop this, or I see Prashasti has also dropped this question in the chat. There's quite a bit to this question, so it would be helpful to the audience to also take a look. There's been a lot of discourse around co-option of settler decolonization and decolonization in general. Do you see a difference between the two? What actions do you envision settler decolonization to require, particularly from folks in the legal field, given that that's our demographic currently? And perhaps, I was thinking that perhaps these actions require sort of an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach to combat the policy remnants of settler colonialism. So is there a way sort of to integrate this sustainable change to the decolonization agenda? And if you can comment on this, I think I find it not to maybe pick on one person or specifically Desiree, but I did find it very impressive that, Desiree comes from a non-legal background and sort of an architecture background, specifically landscape architecture, how you got into this kind of issue, and you took a sort of interdisciplinary approach. And I know you commented a little bit about it before, but I think it would be really helpful, your experience on combining critical heritage infrastructure studies, migration and mobility studies, and in the Indigenous Pacific, and how you were able to, make sort of impact. So that would be, I think that would be really helpful for people that are thinking about becoming advocates and activists. And perhaps the panel can also think about what gaps that are needed to be bridged by policy advocates. Perhaps that Desiree has taken the approach from an architectural background, but is there another another discipline that perhaps the issue can be better mitigated from or approached from? So I open it to the floor, whoever wants to.
So I'm happy to just quickly respond. I think this is such a loaded question, and I'll really just talk about the interdisciplinarity and collaborative kind of approach. I think for me, it was realizing that my architectural education was really insufficient. And this was about 10 years ago when I was in practice, working in Toronto, designing these privately owned public spaces, which are just gardens on the top of condo buildings that exceeded their height. So as a SORI or as a, kind of penalty, they had to put up these gardens, and that made me really think about public space in a more critical way in my role. And we don't really have legal education at all in a field like landscape architecture. We don't look at land title records. And I think for me, that was just an interest and wanting to study sites in a way that wasn't just kind of commenting on built heritage or what remains or the design of things. And Berkeley kind of gave me the opportunity to enter spaces like law schools, which are incredibly terrifying spaces when you're not used to the protocol. And for me, my first class was art and cultural property law. And I remember sitting in the back and being very afraid to be called on for possibly not remembering the contents of the textbook or the case we had read. But it was also thinking about Asian North American studies, legal geography, and fields where I guess, as Letty says, there's sort of these fuzzy boundaries, and there's also people who aren't legally trained that are engaging. And I found historians and geographers to be the most exciting people who were doing that type of work, first at my own university and then in broader communities. But for me, again, it starts from a fundamental question of, how do I approach a research question, and what do I need? What tools am I lacking? What do I need to read? What do I need to develop on? And who do I need to be speaking to? And I think working in preservation, understanding the law and land title. And Roxanne, you're a huge hero for me, but also understanding how these operate beyond the contiguous US in places like Hawaii and Alaska that have, multiple overlapping sort of colonialisms. If we think of Russian resource colonialism in Alaska and then American settler colonialism, there's just a whole other way about thinking of land that can't be mapped on very neatly to laws that are applied in the mainland. So I'll just stop there.
I really was excited to see that Desiree was going to be on this panel just because she's a landscape architect, because in fact, I've been in touch with several. It just blew my mind when a couple of different landscape architects contacted me from Virginia, where they're trying to get rid of, Confederate monuments, and these landscape architects brought up the question of colonial ones, the ones that they're usually the same person, but sometimes they're very special people like Braxton Bragg, or, who was the Indian killer deluxe and a Confederate, became a Confederate. He was part of the United States when he was an Indian killer, so was Robert E. Lee. So they really, and also geographers. So I find this, this interdisciplinary, I'm a very stuck in the mud historian, so it has really opened my mind to understanding space and land. And of course, I've learned that also from Indigenous peoples on the land, from a really colonial point of view. But in terms of how to change things, I think we can really do some collective thinking that's important. I want to bring up another point about the trend of US social justice movements and much of the scholarly work that has been done in the United States is about deracializing and not decolonizing. But actually, if you think about it, a deracialized United States would remain a settler society and a settler state. It's hanging on fine with all the deracialization that is going on. And then in order, to be expansive about it, the attempts to include Native peoples as victims of racism really kind of camouflages settler colonialism and constitutes a type of social genocide, individualizing, rather than looking at Native people as collectives, more than 500. So the polity has been trying to rid itself of Indigenous nations since the very first settlement. And 400 years later, multiculturalism is the mechanism for avoiding acknowledgement of settler colonialism. So the very existence of Indigenous nations constitutes a claim on land and therefore a critique of settler sovereignty and an obstacle to the settler economy. So I think that's another important collaboration that's needed, is with Black scholars and scholars of racial capitalism to really understand that these both are important, but they're like going in tubes and not relating enough to each other, because basically race is also a colonial construct.
Yeah, maybe I'll just speak a little bit to, and I know this is maybe going to another sort of more imagining a borderless future kind of question, but I just want to speak to social movements a little bit, and that some of the research that I did and my own sort of activism has given me the privilege of finding social movements that are really trying to center settler colonialism in their approach. So a couple that I think of, I'm sure Desiree may be familiar with the No One is Illegal movement that was founded in, I believe, Montreal and
Vancouver.
And it, it really was, it is sort of, I'll read a little bit about their mission. It was, initiated after September 11th. Let me find my page. Here we go. No One is Illegal is an extended network of immigrant rights groups rooted in anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, ecological justice, Indigenous self-determination, anti-occupation, and anti-oppressive communities. The ultimate vision of No One is Illegal is to build a movement based on dismantling settler colonialism through the affirmation of Indigenous self-determination and the welcoming of immigrants to live in respectful relationship to existing communities on the land. I know that this series has put together a wonderful interactive syllabus, and I was taking a look at it, and I think in almost every one of your series sections is Harsha Walia's Border Imperialism, and she talks a lot about the formation of this movement, and I think it's a movement that we can draw inspiration from. It's rooted in centering settler colonialism within immigrant rights, migrant rights movements. There's others. I talk about the sort of passport ceremony that was founded in Australia, where that was sort of initiated by migrants who wanted to honor not the Australian sovereign state, but Indigenous, the Aboriginal Indigenous sovereignty there by creating a passport ceremony where the Aboriginal communities grant a passport to migrant communities. I think there's a lot of powerful lessons to be learned there. So I just think there's a way for us in the legal academy to be looking at social movements that do that kind of boundary breaking, border breaking work, to center that, to make that part of the curriculum, to learn lessons from that rather than case books. So I think there is some way for us to imagine a different kind of approach within the law that centers settler colonialism.
Those were amazing responses, and I just want to sort of weigh in on some of the themes. So when we think about colonialism in the legal field, that is a term of art, right? So if we think about classic colonialism and the construct of human rights, self-determination as a strategy to decolonize legitimately within the international order. So there are, sort of a bunch of factors you have to go through. And of course, what we're talking about, settler colonialism and Indigenous peoples, doesn't fit that model, which is why for so many years, the human rights community actively worked against the idea that Indigenous peoples had a right of self-determination as peoples in that classic sense. The intermediate zone for globalization is all around neocolonialism, right? And how that cycle works in economics and in capturing human labor and in capturing parts of the land as quote unquote resources. So we're embedded in that structure, whether we like it or not, right? Tribal governments are as embedded in that structure as any other government, but we don't call it that. So settler colonialism as a term requires us to engage all of that, right? We have to be honest with ourselves, and thank you for all the discussion about the role of social movements. I obviously am working with a lot of my students who are, framing this intersectional way of envisioning social justice, and they're beautiful, right? Because they come from all of these different places and they want to support Indigenous peoples. But I think it is incumbent on Indigenous peoples to actually name the terms of that. And so for me, it is the discourse of self-determination, the inherent right of a people to autonomous governance, both of itself, but its territory. And the territory doesn't map on to the sovereign boundaries of the nation states. The territory, it's always been there, and the people have always been there. And it's that way of thinking that decolonizes our own minds and lets us see what we are participating in this government, because there are a lot of perks that come even to Indigenous peoples who are federally recognized Native nations. There's a status and a recognized form of that entitles the nation to claim this thing called sovereignty. But what sovereignty really is as a cultural phenomenon. It is that identity of a people in place over generations and into the future. And to stand up for that and the qualities of that relationship, that is the challenge today. You can see that, and Desiree, thank you so much for your work. Your work is amazing because it is visionary, that the imagining of people in place is a powerful exercise. And I see that so much in your work. And you are absolutely right that the conditions of that, in what we would frame as the United States versus the newer states, Alaska and Hawaii, if you look in all of those places, you can see how settler colonialism reinvented itself and started to disengage that construct of people in place through ANCSA, the oil pipelines, the idea of corporations taking over and really mastering the resources of the land. And that is the challenge. That is the challenge. As much as we don't want to think about those things, we must think about those things. So thank you to all of the colleagues who weighed in. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for sharing that. And I hope that this, in addition to all the things that you have shared, that you check out also the interactive syllabus, because there are other opportunities for how to engage this issue a bit deeper. I would like to move on to our final question, but before I do, I wanted to give an opportunity for the audience we might have a couple of extra minutes at the end, so I want to give an opportunity to drop in some questions in the chat. I do want to put a caveat that if we have a couple, I suspect that we'll have maybe like 5 minutes, but so we might not get to all of the questions, but if there's any sort of burning questions people have, we can possibly select one. So in the final question that we have, we have dropped it in the chat as well. It's regarding envisioning borderless futures and its effect on sovereignty. So we wanted to talk about Indigenous sovereignty and borderless futures. What would sovereignty mean or look like in a world without borders? What would it mean to immigrate to an Indigenous land? What would those relationships look like, and how do we begin to imagine that within our immigration justice movements? I open it to the floor, whoever would like to begin.
I can begin. I wanted to add to Monica's about no one is illegal, because I think it's important to this question. I know Harsha Walia. I've known her since she began No One is Illegal in Vancouver, only in Vancouver. She's a South Asian immigrant family. And from the very beginning, it's very different in Canada how immigrants and even settlers are much more in relationship with Native people. For one thing, the population of Canada lives within 100 miles of the border, and the rest of that vast territory is Indigenous. with only, some administrators and all, who are settlers or government officials. So it's a very different situation. Also, they didn't have legalized, codified racial slavery. So there are different situations, but I do think no one is illegal is definitely the model that we need to introduce in the United States. I was invited to the 10th anniversary of the founding of No One is Illegal in Vancouver a few years ago, and it just really blew my mind. I was invited to be a keynote speaker that in this huge auditorium packed with immigrants from all over the world. Up front were the British of Columbia chiefs sitting and facing them. So it's always a dialogue. They've learned, they teach the immigrants about native land claims, and about treaties, and about colonization. And so it's a processing that we don't, I don't think we have the mechanism for that, but we do have the model. We have Harsha herself, who comes and, is happy to talk to people and help get started. And so I think that's really, really important. But I want to talk about borderless futures. I may have a different opinion than others, but I think a borderless reality already exists for US the capitalist state through imperialism. National boundaries for former colonies that have become states and for indigenous held land bases are essential in resisting the capitalist state imperialism, creating border interventions. So I think the discussions of a borderless near future is dangerous and falls into really basically a capitalist mentality, because that's what exists. Rather, I think we need to mount an argument and curricula and movements for understanding that the existing US border with Mexico is illegal. It is not based on the concept of borderlessness, in my mind, such a movement. Rather, that the border was established illegally through a 2-year war of aggression and occupation, and a treaty made with Mexico under occupation, with a gun to the head of the signers in Mexico to relinquish the northern half of the country. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would not stand up as a legitimate in a case brought by the Republic of Mexico in the World Court. But the United States would ignore the decision, as they always do. And Mexico would be savagely punished by the US for raising it. So I think it will take a massive movement to challenge that border and end the hideous misery that is produced there.
I'm happy to jump in really briefly here. I think I've been thinking a lot about sanctuary cities and sanctuary spaces and what it means to provide sanctuary. And this is, again, from an architectural perspective. When I arrived in Berkeley in 2015, there was a lot of talk about sanctuary in different contexts, and just interrogating that term, but also interrogating the term immigration, because it doesn't necessarily, as someone who's studying forced, wartime migration, that's all internal within a nation state, how do we think about issues like climate change that are going to displace and dislocate people from the lands where they are, and how is that going to change migration patterns within a so-called border? And the last, I think, concept for me is really thinking about citizenship, and this question, what would it mean to immigrate to Indigenous land, really makes me think in a broader way of what would it mean once you immigrate. Do you go through a process of citizenship? And I reflect on my own family's journey from Mumbai, India, and where citizenship in Canada meant, this codification and a very positive development. At least my dad thought so. I was in my first year of university at the time and got to miss class to go to a citizenship ceremony. And unlike what Roxanne described, at the time, there was no acknowledgement of Indigenous. This was around 2005. We took a quiz or a test, and it was about French and British colonial history. So I remember kind of that leaving a strange sort of taste in my mouth, but thinking also critically about what it means to be a lawful immigrant. And for my family, that has caused a lot of contestation because it provides, or citizenship claims to provide a purported equal opportunity and a subsequent full incorporation into, what's considered universal citizenship. And I think, if we are to think about immigrating to Indigenous land, how would citizenship function? What would it mean to think about sanctuary in a new way? And how do we fundamentally critique citizenship? And I think of literature in Asian American studies where there are critiques of citizenship from all vantage points, especially from Hawaii and statehood. But I think more broadly, how do we think about studying Turtle Island, the non-contiguous land masses, the US minor outlying islands that are rarely represented on a map? And how do we think about land and territory through other types of perspectives, maybe the oceanic or hemispheric, to think about connections beyond just kind of a single contiguous landmass that defies how citizenship operates within these areas. So that was a lot of, I think, disparate thoughts, but I think I'm curious to hear what others have to say, and if there's time, jump back in again.
So I'll just respond to some of those themes too. Desiree and Roxanne, you both raised amazing points. When we think about the citizen as a legal concept, it's a very narrow construct. It's a political construct. And that means that the citizen has certain rights, and then the nation state has certain rights to regulate the citizen. And that's the relationship that you're in. We don't think about the cultural features of citizen. As Roxanne says, that discourse in the United States of multiculturalism really suppresses any other identity, and it creates sort of a celebration of like different food or music or something, and somehow that's supposed to be a proxy for this idea of cultural citizenship. So if we thought about Indigenous sovereignty and what the land would be without a border, and this is the challenge of the work that I'm doing right now, I'm envisioning that all of these borders are imagined borders. As Roxanne said, they're really shaky on legal grounds. All of this, Hawaii is shaky on legal grounds, right? The dream will be a dog shaky on legal grounds. But we've imagined a reality to that. And so we dutifully police the southern border, and the vigilante activity, the violence has always been part of that southern border, always. And Native people were always both victimized and implicated within the border violence. On the northern border, amazingly enough, the US-Canada border, the First Nations and the Indigenous nations on this side of that imagined border truly claimed that territorial identity, and they still do. And I see the human rights work that is happening on that northern border led the Canadian Supreme Court to acknowledge the treaty rights of a US tribal member to hunt on the Canadian side of the border, because that was their traditional territory. That was a historic holding by the Canada Supreme Court. Similarly, the Lummi tribe in the Pacific Northwest has participated in the discourse about that oil refinery and terminal on the British Columbia side, because they're the custodian of that land. It doesn't matter that they're a US tribe, that is their territory, and they have claimed a space. And what it distills to is a sense of responsibility to the land. That's what it means to be a citizen of the land in an Indigenous identity. It means that you have a responsibility to that place. And the other part of it is all imagined. The reality of it is your relationship with place. But as Desiree says, the climate situation is causing flooding and fires and resettlement and this idea of a climate refugee. How ridiculous is that? It doesn't even fit into the UN structure in terms of a refugee. It's some category that has no identity to it in a political sense. So when we think about quote unquote what it means to be an alien, what it means to be a climate refugee, these are categories that come out of those imagined borders, and we must take a stand that is relational and situated in responsibility. Thank you.
I'm just reveling in the beauty of what I've heard, and I'm learning and I'm growing. And I think, you know, one thing that I think about is something that I recently read about the Caravan and what that represents. So I'm just going to read what Shirley Munshi talks about when she talks about the Caravan. By traveling together, the migrants of the Caravan shielded one another from rape and robbery, while avoiding coyotes profiting from others' displacement by charging thousands of dollars, and to whom the migrants might otherwise become perilously indebted for life. Engaged in collective acts of waymaking, the migrants of the Caravan rehearsed forms of citizenship not reducible to legal status or entitlement. And I think that's when I'm listening to you, Rebecca, I'm just thinking of how the imagining that needs to happen is a different, like you said, relationship to each other, relationship to the land, relationship to how we think about borders. So thank you. I look forward to hearing what other people have to say, and if we have time for questions, I don't know.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you to all the other panelists for answering this question. I do not see questions from the audience, but if you want to, you can drop them down. We only have a couple of minutes now, but I guess I can ask a little bit more about just maybe more of a sort of a US the approach one could take to like US government policies. I'm specifically thinking about issues with policies like the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, which I know that Professor Kashyap has written about before. And so I was just wondering, when it comes to those kinds of like policies, like is there something that can those policies sort of be prevented from happening? Is it possible? Are there, is the government just too overwhelming as a force and not enough sort of advocates or groups that can leverage support for issues regarding regarding like I guess like supporting immigrants and trying to advocate for their particular their existence and their rights on this like in America more specifically. I know that also looking at Professor Tsosie's work on identifying sort of the different types of ways that Indigenous people can be characterized. I know you came up with sort of a framework of 5 different types. And so I don't know if that would be a possible solution to the problem, rethinking the way that the US government thinks about immigrants. But so I just wanted to open up that question, like what can we do practically with US government policies and foreign policies, perhaps?
Monika, you need to answer one about what the United States and its national security policies. I'm not even going to venture into that territory. So you take that one, and then I'll weigh in on citizenship.
I was gonna let you go first, but you know, my work on, so I talk a little bit about some of the most, I guess you could call it egregious laws that this country has produced. You know, I talk about the National Security Entry-Exit System, NSEERS, National Security Entry-Exit Registration, important word, system, which some of you may not know about, but it was really the precursor to the Muslim bans that the Trump administration came up with. So it's important to know about them. So I highly recommend Googling NSEERS. I know we don't have too much time to go into it, but it was it was the precursor where it was a system post 9/11, national security motivated, but nothing very different from anything that the country had done before with the Chinese Exclusion Act, with the practice of Japanese internment. So I speak about these sort of egregious ones that pop out only to kind of bring you into the reality that this is what the foundation of our laws have always been. So I think, to me, to begin to address and to change that beginning has to be a reckoning of the depth and the very fabric of our laws being rooted in that kind of egregiousness that we may think is only incarnate in things like the Muslim ban or NSEERS. So I know it's not the most beautiful answer, but I think for me, what's most important to creating change is a reckoning with the, like I said, the depth of the egregiousness and that its origin.
Thank you. And I know that we're close to time, so there's so much that could be said on this. But following from what you just said, Monika, I think the challenge is that we imagine ourselves in this world. And I'm going to use, again, the rubric of self-determination, because that's the current moment. What does it mean to be Indigenous, have a right to self-determination as a people? And in my case, it's a transborder people. What does that mean? And then you see how history and the United States government and its institutions have crafted different frames. They're not the same frame. We started out separate nations with a treaty relationship. We were aliens to the United States that became normalized as this thing called a domestic dependent nation. You'll only find it in federal Indian law. It doesn't exist anywhere else. But that was the baseline for the status of a ward in the 19th century, which had no rights, none. That's why you got the mandatory boarding schools. That's why you got genocide. That's why you got land theft, no rights. Then you got the US saying in 1924, oh, you're citizens of the United States. And the state said, well, that's great. You're not citizens of the state. That took the civil rights era to turn us into equal citizens, maybe, question mark, and maybe not, right? So this idea of self-determination is that identity of a people that's situated in a place, but we have to engage with the domestic sovereigns on either side of us. So I'm not as far along on that as you are, Monika. So the national security stuff right now really concerns me, because that is the baseline for another episode of violence, as you said, Roxanne, that could be truly horrific. But because I am committed to peace and reconciliation, I don't let myself go there in my imagined state, if that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your responses on that. I appreciate it. And I want to thank all of the panelists today for their contribution and amazing scholarship and their continued work, especially for having these conversations without pay and amid a pandemic. And I also wanted to thank our co-sponsors and to you all for joining us today. We encourage you to continue these conversations amongst yourselves using our interactive syllabus and continue with us in our next discussion on criminalization this upcoming Monday, February 14th, and human rights later this month on February 25th. Prashasti will follow up with this information in an email. So I guess have a look out for that. And thank you again for today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, panelists. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.